Welcome to the Untold Civil War, and we're here with another steward of history. Ben Pauley is a real mover and shaker in the community. He is not only a collector of these beautiful images, a dealer of these beautiful images, he's also an author. And I have a few of his books here that I use as references multiple times throughout my collecting. So thank you so much for coming on the show to share your story and give some of us new collectors some tips to get into the hobby. So I really appreciate that.
My pleasure. It's great to be here. Wonderful to be here.
So the first thing I'd like to ask is, when did the Civil War bug bite you?
Well, it bit me about the same time it bit a lot of people my age, which was following the Ken Burns series on PBS. So call it 89, 88, 89, somewhere in there. It was when I started collecting. I was wandering through an antique shop in northern Indiana and saw a photograph of a Civil War soldier. And it really had not occurred to me that those were even out there, that was a thing. And bought my first photograph. It probably was about 1989.
What is it about photographs, though? I mean, you could have collected anything. You could have done swords, you could have done Civil War buttons, you could have done Civil War bullets, you know?
Yeah,
What about photographs?
I think it's the humanity that it adds to it, because you're looking at a real person, and in a lot of these images, they could be with us today. I mean, they don't look any different. The styles are different, their hair is different in some cases, but it just puts the whole human factor into the hobby. And I've got a couple situations where I've got two different photographs of the same person, and you can only tell because one hand is moved ever so slightly, or a cap is just slightly tilted differently. And that's always a joy to find, is when you can get more than one of the same guy. That's a bonus for me anyway.
But you also deal in images, right?
Yeah, it's more of a hobby. It's not a formal business. It's a hobby business, but it allows me to add to my collection. I can improve my collection. I can kind of wean out some of the ones that are not my favorites. Take that money and parlay it up to some even better images. So I do deal in photographs, but it's really not a business. Hope it maybe upon retirement from my real job, I'd love to take it there, but it's just not there today yet.
Well, because you're also dealing and you're also collecting,
Mhm.
you must have a very niche, no, in your collecting. When you decide what to sell and what to keep. So, what do you primarily? How do you make that decision? What do you primarily collect?
Well, I live in Indiana, so I collect Indiana soldiers CDVs, and I've got hundreds of those. Um, and I don't collect any specific regiment. I probably should focus a lot more than I do, but I'm kind of all over. But any Indiana soldier, particularly if he's identified, is a real plus for me. But then on the hard images, I like something unique. They have a weapon, they're in an odd pose, they have an unusual uniform, they're ID'd. Getting a hard image that's ID'd is a big bonus, because they're not a lot of them are. In fact, most of them are not. But if there's just something unique about the image, some factor that's in there, and images that are just crystal clear, those are just the best. That's what I really love. But you pay for it too. Those don't come cheap.
You mentioned hard images and you mentioned CDVs. For some people who might
Yeah.
not know, could you explain what those are?
Right. So a CDV is on paper, and they were mass produced. So you would go to a photographer and get your picture taken, and then they could run off 10 or 20 copies of the same CDV. They were used in many cases as calling cards and traded, almost like baseball cards today. So they were traded. You would get all of your buddies and put them in an album, and you would trade your photograph for another guy's photograph. The hard images are either tintypes or ambrotypes, and the tintype is on metal, and the ambrotype is on glass. And I particularly like the ambrotypes. They seem to me to be a little bit better focused on average than the tintypes are.
So, are the hard images a little more personal? Or they're not so many duplicates? Or
Right. There would not be that many duplicates. You could get multiples made when you went into the studio, and you would probably get multiples made. So they're fewer. They're maybe a little bit, arguably a little more fragile, particularly the ambrotypes, a little more fragile whereas the CDVs, the cartavistas, are a little more durable because they're on a cardstock and on paper.
Of course, talking about hard images, that's sort of the theme of today
Mhm,
of what's behind the mat.
mhm.
So can we get into a little bit about that? How can you describe a hard image in the case? And then what do we talk about when we say what's behind the mat?
Yeah, so an image um, will typically have a mat, a keeper, and glass, and then come in a case. So it really the mat allows the visual to kind of focus on the soldier himself. Uh, but oftentimes there's stuff behind those mats. You'll find situations where you can see some guy's legs who's sitting on a chair just outside of the main picture, and it's covered by a mat. Or there is a piece of equipment. There might be a sword leaning up against a wall, or you can see a window on the side of the wall that's used for lighting the image that you would never see unless you took the image out of the case and out of the mat. The mat looks like it's tends to be a brass color. It's not brass, but it tends to be that color. And they're beautiful. Everybody, people who do not collect often ask me, they're more focused on the case and the mat than they are on the photograph. They think that's particularly valuable, and some can be of value, but it's really the photograph that has the interest and has the value.
Can you take us back to maybe the first time, or maybe it was a few times, but when did you actually have a hard image and say, you know what, let me remove the mat here and see what's behind that? I mean, sometimes when I look at a hard image, I don't want to touch it. I'm a little nervous, but what was it to lead you on a further investigation that you discovered that?
Often you get the image and the cover glass is filthy dirty, and it obscures a little bit of the image. So you take it out and very carefully clean that glass. And when you've got that image out of the case, you've taken the foil keeper off to get the glass out of there to clean it off. Um, the mat just generally comes off very, very easily. And the way you assemble them is you want the image, and you want the mat, and then you want the glass on top, because you want a barrier between that glass and the actual image. So to get that glass clean, you've got to take the image out of the case, and that's the opportunity to see, hey, is there anything behind the mat?
Let's talk about some of the images you've actually shared with me,
Sure,
because
sure,
some of these images have some really interesting details behind the mat.
sure. Yeah, let's look at
So
them.
if, I'm going to pull some up here just to look at.
Okay.
So the first one I'm looking at here, it looks like a musician who's actually cut some of the mat out to
Right.
include his drum. So how did you find that image, and why did you pick up this image here?
Yeah. So that comes from the collection of Chris Anderson. He is my co-author on the books that we've put together. Chris focuses on Confederates when I tend to focus on Union soldiers. But he had found that image a number of years ago, and it was interesting because clearly the subject, or the person who was having their picture taken, thought that having the drum in the image was particularly important. So they trimmed the mat back. It looks awkward in the case, but it does show the drum. You'd almost like to have that drum sitting on his lap, or maybe sitting at his side. But when the photograph was taken, it was taken kind of out of the frame of picture and behind the mat. But clearly, that was very important to the subject to have that drum in the picture to be seen. Was he a drummer? I mean, probably. That'd be my guess. Can't prove it, but probably.
And the next image here, I think it really speaks to us because, first of all, when you first look at it, it's a great image. You have the Union soldier there. He's armed. He's got a saber there, but you can also see, I guess, once you remove the mat, people waiting to get their photo, or maybe they're just curious to see, their buddy getting his photo taken. What does that tell you about the Civil War days, and about the people who are in these photographs?
I mean, if you're the photographer, don't you think you'd say, "Hey, dudes, step back a little bit, step back"? But he didn't. He didn't. Um, and so those guys are just hanging out, waiting. So photography was somewhat novel at the time. It was not commonplace. So that would have been an event to go to the photographer and pay your money to get your picture taken. Those are probably his buddies who are waiting in line to go next, and they're observing the photography process. But again, that photographer, it's like, come on, guys, can you just take a step back? You'll get your turn. You'll get your turn. So I love that when there's somebody just out of the picture and hidden behind the mat.
I guess that sort of gives us an idea of how these photographs or where these photographs were taken because, it's either a crowded gallery or crowded tent in the field,
Right, 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 right. And so often when you look at some of these images, when you take the mat off, you can see more down toward the subject's feet. And oftentimes they are staying outside. Sometimes you can see grass. Sometimes you can see debris, branches and leaves and that kind of stuff. And that it's taken outside. Whereas with that mat on there, you might not know. It may have just a plain white backdrop, which may be, the side of a tent or either interior or exterior.
And as we talk about some of the ways that images are taken, when you remove the backdrop, sometimes, excuse me, the mat, you see more of the backdrop,
Correct, right.
which I see in these next two images with the Benton Barracks in St. Louis.
Uh-huh.
So, could you talk a little bit about what exactly is a
Yeah.
backdrop and, you know, why would soldiers pose in front of certain backdrops, or why would photographers, what theme did they go for with these backdrops?
Also, there was a lot of competition with these photographers. They're making good money, taking portraits and then selling the portraits in the cases. And so if you were a photographer and you had competition, you wanted your studio to be the one that people wanted to go to. And again, if you're 16 or 17 or 18 or 19, doesn't matter how old you are, and you're going to get your picture taken, and you're going to send it back to mom or dad or the sweetheart. Having a military theme is a real drawing card. And these backdrops come in a variety of quality. These would have been hand painted. They would not have been mass produced, but they would have been hand painted. And the more realistic, the better. And having some guy on a horse in back there is great. Having a soldier marching with a rifle on his shoulder is great. Cannons and forts are really good. So that Benton Barracks backdrop, there are several different photographers that were operating out of Benton's Barrack in St. Louis. And I am by no means an expert, but there's a great article on the Benton's Barracks backdrop in Military Images. So I encourage you, if you subscribe to that, to do some research and look at that, because they tend to be pretty high quality backdrops with forts up on a hill, or a cannon or a map with the state of Missouri on it. Now the map would have been drawn backwards, because in these images they are in reverse. So you'll see a belt buckle that looks like it says SU, but it's a US belt buckle, but they are in reverse. So when these artists would have these drawn, if there was any writing or anything of that sort, it had to be done in reverse, so it looked normal in the photograph.
I know in our lives, we're always carrying around paperwork and that sort of thing. We've got tons of receipts in our pockets. In this next image, you actually have a soldier posing, and it looks like there's some paperwork on the ground when you remove the mat. What does that tell us? I mean, that's just wild.
Yeah, so clearly he didn't want to be holding it in the photograph. Is it his? I would think maybe. Is it the photographer's? I would think not, because this photographer probably doesn't want to have litter all over the floor of his studio or his tent. So I guess I'd like to think it was the soldiers. And was that a pass? Was it a letter? I mean, I don't know. But he didn't want to be holding it in his hand when he got his picture taken, and he could have put it in his pocket or set it over there on the bench, whatever. But for some reason, he tossed it on the ground. Now, with the mat on there, it's not obvious in the photograph. So when he had that matted and sent home to his wife or mom and dad, they wouldn't have seen that paperwork in there. But boy, when you take the mat off, when you take the image out of the case to clean the glass, and you take that mat off, there's interesting stuff down there to discover.
Well, I think it sort of humanizes it too, because I can imagine myself, running chores, and suddenly I think, oh, maybe I should get my picture taken. It's one of the many things that I'm supposed to do today, and
Sure.
you've got all this paperwork, and you're just trying to set it down.
Right.
I think it does a great deal to humanize the image as well.
Right. Yeah, it does. Not too different from you and me.
Absolutely. Of course, this next image is interesting because it is the Star Gallery in Indianapolis,
Mhm.
and you actually get to see the reflective screen once
Mhm.
you remove the mat. And
Right.
so that kind of really does give us an idea of how these photos were taken, right?
Right. Yeah. So that backdrop is identified via a good friend of mine, Rick Brown, who's a just a great image collector, has a wonderful collection, and he has done a lot of research. He's got family from Indiana. He's done a lot of research on backdrops that come out of studios in Indiana. So that was in a studio. I think it was on the main east-west street in downtown Indianapolis, which was Washington Street, and they would have had a white screen there to reflect light coming from either a skylight or a window back onto the subject. And when you take that mat off, you find that that's in the photo, because you want to get it close enough to the subject to throw a lot of light on them, but you don't want it too close that it's going to get in the main frame of the photograph. So fortunately, you have a mat that eliminates a lot of that, a lot of that ancillary equipment in the studio.
And these are techniques still used today in photography, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, you go to a wedding, the wedding photographer, and they've got a big boom umbrella kind of thing that throws light down onto the subject. So yeah, the technique is as old as photography is, and it's still used today. You're right.
This next image I really love because it is I believe it's a cavalryman or horse soldier,
Mhm.
and you have the flag in the background.
Yeah,
And for the photo sleuth, for us Civil War buffs, when we're looking at this, that does help us sort of date the
right.
image, right? In a way, it gives us a clue, right?
Well, if you
Because
could
of
see
how
how
many
many stars,
stars, right?
yeah, if you can see, and a lot of the photographs will have a flag. The photographer will have a flag draped over a table, or kind of hanging in the background, and it's rare to be able to see all of the stars. But yeah, that will give you an idea of when the photograph was taken. And then, if I recall the photograph you're talking about, I think it had 31 stars. Is that right? Yeah. So this would have been old. This would have been pre-Civil War, this flag. Not that it mattered, who cared. Flags weren't standardized until I think 1917. So the canton, the star pattern could be anything, could be a starburst, could be different combinations of rows. And a lot of times you're going to see a flag where they've sewn on a random star. So they've taken a 31 star flag, and whatever state 32 was, whether it was Kansas or Nebraska or whatever it was, comes in, somebody has to get out the needle and thread and cut a muslin star to sew it on to make it current. But yeah, it does allow you in some cases to date it. It does.
This next image shows a soldier with what appears to be a flintlock.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about that? I mean, were you soldiers armed with flintlocks, or was this a prop? Maybe. What exactly
I,
are we looking at?
I am not a weapons expert by any means, but the flintlock would have been an old gun coming into 1861 into the Civil War. Um, I understand that there were soldiers that carried flintlocks very early in the war. Maybe they brought it from home. It's possible they brought it from home. They were patriotic. They were excited about this war because it's only going to last a couple months, and we know that was not the case. But it may be a situation where they formed this regiment in their town, or this company in their town, and they didn't have weapons, so they brought their own along with them. And again, it could be a good observation on your part. Maybe it's just a prop that the photographer had. Um, but yeah, you just don't see a lot of flintlocks in photographs. I've only seen two, and I know they're out there, but I've only owned two that have had a flintlock in the image. It's just kind of a rarity.
And in this image, you actually get to see the log that is used as a support. So it
Yeah,
kind of gives you sort of the makeshift idea of how these photographers, what they were working with. They
right,
were just kind of using materials that they could find
right.
to make these galleries, these studios, especially in the field. But also, he's got possibly his knapsack resting up on top of one of the
I'm not 100% sure what that is, but it
yeah.
does to me. It does look like a knapsack. You don't, I can't get the whole three-dimensional view on it, but has he just hung it up? You know, there's a screen there. Has he just hung it over one of the knobs on the screen? And that one is interesting, that with the mat, sometimes you can see a little bit of it sticking out from under the mat, but when you take the mat off, you get a much better view of it. But I think it's a knapsack. I can't imagine what else it might be.
You know, I'm looking at it too, and I mean, I think it's a knapsack. I mean, but also too, I kind of think about the photographer, and I'm like, why would you tell somebody, oh yeah, just throw that up on your you know, part of my
Yeah,
equipment here, no problem, you
that's
know?
an idea. Set it over by the door and it won't get in the picture, you know, but not the case, not the case. Um, you know, and I would have thought that that knapsack might have been heavy enough that it might not be very sturdy hanging up on that screen, that canvas screen. But sure enough, somebody has hung something up there. And I kind of like to fantasize that the soldier came in out of the field, was maybe going to the settler to get something, and decided to swing past and get his picture taken. It was payday and he got money and wanted to get his picture taken, but he's got his knapsack with him. And it would have been, it would have been better, Paul, is if he worn the knapsack in the picture and gotten a picture wearing it. That would have been cool, but not the case.
You know, it's always, I laugh about these situations where, you know, we get excited about a certain uniform or you know, equipment in the image. You know, I always say when I read letters, I say, I wish you would have just described exactly what he was wearing, you know, describe the uniform. And probably if I talked to a soldier back then, they'd be like, really?
Yeah,
You want to know what buttons I was wearing? My, you know, my belt buckle?
yeah, right.
But
Okay.
we love that stuff.
Sure, for sure, absolutely. Another feature that I see in a lot of the images is where they've turned their belt buckle upside down. And Paul, I think you've probably seen that. And they do that so that it kind of looks like it says US on it. So when it's reversed, and I've heard a lot of people say, well, no, that must be a Confederate because they turned their US upside down. I'm like, I think not. I think it's just purely because they know it's going to be in the photograph and they want it to make it look like it kind of reads right. And then the photographer would come in and apply some gilding on it, and maybe make it US even though it's upside down. But you see that in a lot of images. And I've had, again, people tell me, well, they must be Confederate. Not true. I don't believe that's true.
Yeah, it's not really a patriotic statement or political statement, I should say. It really is
Right.
just possibly practicality, right?
And aesthetics for the photograph. Yeah. Hmm.
The next image is really neat because you have NCO, non-commissioned officer here. It looks like he's a cavalryman, another horse soldier, but you actually get to see a little bit of the studio in this, and you get to see a window to his left, right?
Right. Right. Again, not visible when the mat's on it, but very visible, very obvious. That photograph would have been taken at a point in time where that easterly facing window in the morning is coming through throwing a lot of light from sunlight in, and might not have been able to take a photograph later in the day if the light's not coming in the right direction. But yeah, there's definitely a full-fledged in studio window that they're utilizing to get enough light on the subject.
Again, you know, you speak to any photographer today, it's, you know, one of those things that they're attempting to do, always get more light, right?
Right. Exactly.
This next image, we just spoke about uh military backdrops and how amazing they are to have these military themed backdrops and the artistry that goes into them. And yet some people want to cover them up and they don't want to pose in front of a military themed backdrop or any backdrop for that matter. And we actually see this in this next image. There's a infantryman there. He's armed, and there's actually I guess you could say, canvas or screen covering a backdrop, right?
Right. And I guess it's personal taste. So you walk in and you talk to the photographer. Here's what I'd like. But gosh, if it were me, I'd want that military theme backdrop back there. But you've got choices. I mean, you've got choices. So the photographer, probably at the subject's request, took that military theme backdrop and hung a canvas sheet on top of it to give a bright white backdrop to the subject. But again, you don't see that unless you take the mat off. And that was an aha moment for me. I'm thinking, holy smokes, why wouldn't he go with the military themed backdrop? And an expert better than me would probably know what that backdrop is. I think that might be the Beaufort, South Carolina backdrop, but I'm not 100% sure. That's behind the white screen.
It also gives us again how photographers did this. It was just a matter of, I guess, they had multiple screens that they could cover each other,
Yeah.
just to take different photographs with different backdrops. Very
Maybe
interesting image.
here's an idea. Maybe the light in the studio wasn't perfect. Maybe it was the wrong time of day, and maybe by having that stark white backdrop added more light to the setting. So maybe it was functional rather than the subject choice. We'll never know. We'll never know.
I wonder if it could be financial too. Maybe it's a little bit more for the battlefield backdrop. I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, you want the creme de la creme. It's going to be $2.50 to get the battlefield backdrop. You know, that may be it. I don't know. I don't know.
The next image here looks like a cavalryman, right? He's got a saber with him,
Huh?
ambrotype, and again, white screen over a really awesome tropical backdrop. What's going on here? They're
Yeah,
covering all this up.
yeah. Don't know. Yeah, don't know. But again, with the mat on there, you can't pick that up. But it would not have been my choice. But you know, I wasn't there 170 years ago to say I want the stark white backdrop. But I just go back to say, you know, if I'm getting my photograph taken, I'm spending a ton of money to do this. A lot of my pay is going into this. I want as fancy as possible. But it's personal choice.
With these images, do you recall the moment when you discovered them? I mean, discovered you know, the details behind the backdrop. What was that like?
Um, not all of them. Occasionally, if there's something, you know, major, a weapon that's not included in the photograph, but when that mat comes off and you see that there's something leaning up against the wall, a musket or a rifle or you know, that's a real aha moment. The real aha moments for me have been when I've taken that image out of the case and um, there's a name written in the back of the case, or better yet, I've got a really nice Confederate image where his name has been scratched on the brass keeper. And with a little research, I found out he was with the 5th Georgia. Those are the aha moments, is when you find an unexpected ID on the soldier, and then you can spend some time on civilwardata.com or ancestry.com and figure out who they were, where they were, you know, what happened to them. Those are the aha moments for me. It's the identification. It's when they take them out of the case and take the mat off and find something like that. That's like oh well, isn't that cool kind of moment, you know? That's the cherry on top of the whipped cream.
Well, speaking about IDs, the next two images you've shared here are both members of Scots Life Guard.
Yeah.
Uh, how
Yeah.
did you
So
find
this,
out their unit? How did that happen?
well, so the first one, the guy in the Hardy hat, he's wearing a New York style uniform, and I think if I recall correctly, it's a 38. When you blow it up, when you scan it and blow it up, you see 38th New York Company D, which was the second Scots Life Guard. And several years later, and I don't know who he is, I know what the unit is, but several years later, I picked up an image with the exact same backdrop. The flag is in a different position, but you can see the staircase and kind of the railing, so it's the same backdrop. And if I recall correctly, again, he's got a 4 on the front of his forage cap. And doing a little research, that was the first Scots Life Guard. So, you know, I pictured that this was, and they were mostly recruited in New York City. So I got to believe that this was a New York City photographer. The one soldier, when he enlisted early in the war, went and got his picture taken when he was with the 4th New York. And 2 or 3 years later, this younger kid with the Hardy hat went to the same studio. And oh, by the way, it's the same Scots. It's the second Scots Life Guard. So some of those 4th probably re-enlisted and joined the 38th. But I tend to think that the uniform on the younger kid is too pristine, it's too new. I think this was the day that they issued uniforms, and that flag is just beautiful, beautifully tinted, crystal clear image. I love both of those.
Gives us an idea about the recruiting frenzy that was happening, and how you can have two different units with the same nickname, essentially.
Right. Yeah, right. Yeah. So one expired, I assume. Now, I'm no expert on New York units, but the term of service expired on the 4th, and enough people wanted to stick around and re-enlist. So hey, why invent something new? Let go with something that works well. That's how I fantasize about it. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's what I'd like to think.
Oh, absolutely. We saw that with the 69th New York, my alma mater, the unit I like to collect. They went out as a militia unit
Huh?
in the early, 60 days, initially, came back, and there were enough people who wanted to continue fighting the war that they raised a whole nother 69th Volunteer, which was
Okay.
separate from militia, 69th Volunteers. And they
Huh.
had the same nickname and it was basically the same people going into the unit. But they shared that nickname. They shared the sort of the same history, the same people. So you do see that.
Mhm.
This next image is very interesting because here's a backdrop that is not necessarily a military backdrop, but is that a Capitol building in the background? What is that?
Yeah, I assume that's a representation of the U.S. Capitol, but I don't know. There's probably some of your viewers out there will have seen that backdrop before and know where it was taken. I don't personally know, but I'd like to think it's the U.S. Capitol, although the Wisconsin State Capitol looks exactly like the U.S. Capitol as well. I just don't know if the Wisconsin State Capitol was built by the time of the war. Um, but I mean, look how that canvas is curled up on the side. You know, guys, staple that down, pin that down. It looks ratty, but it was good enough for the photographer and it was good enough for the subject.
And then I think the U.S. Capitol, they still had the dome they were working on, so it could be a representation of the completed, the future of the
Sure,
Capitol.
sure,
So it's kind of
certainly.
interesting.
Yeah.
Like you said, maybe there's someone who can view this and give us some ideas. Uh, that was some beautiful images that you shared with us. You've obviously been doing this for a very long time and collecting for a long time to actually lay hands on and eyes on these beautiful images.
Uh,
Let me take you back a little bit to that first image, though. What was
okay.
that first image that got you hooked? Do you still have it in your collection?
Yeah, and I think you can share it with your audience there. It's he's a first sergeant, and it was a little antique shop in Silver Lake, Indiana. Holy smokes, where did that come from? I think it was 1989. And it just had never occurred to me. I saw the Ken Burns series, but it had never occurred to me that there were photographs out there. And I think I paid $68 for it, which in 1989 for me that was a ton of money. But it's a ninth plate tintype. It's crystal clear, and I love the fact that he's turned his body to emphasize that he's a big deal. He's a first sergeant, to make sure that all the viewers of this image, whether it's mom and dad or sweetheart or wife or whomever, know that he's made it. He's a first sergeant, and you see a lot of those first sergeants in a 3/4 pose to make sure that the lozenge and chevrons are visible in the photograph.
For people who are just getting into this, what tips do you have uh, just for the new collector? Or maybe it's a tip for somebody who has been collecting for a while, there's always new information there, new tips. What would you share?
I say get the best that you can afford. More is not better. More is not better. Better is better. So it's worth walking away from an image and save up your money, add it to next payday or next allowance, and get the better image. I love clear. Clear is I mean it's so lifelike and so real. So clear. If maybe you collect weapons, so there are people out there who collect images with carbines in them. Um, I'm not the best person to offer advice on this because I collect everything. I've tried, Paul. I've tried to collect everything and I've failed miserably. But I'm not very focused on my collecting. But I like the unusual, and that's why what's behind the mat kind of came to mind when we were talking about doing this podcast. I thought that might be an unusual thing to share with people because So you might pick up that image and never think to take it out of the case. And who knows, there might be something that you never suspected behind that mat.
Well, your books do this very well, and so I'd like to just kind of get you to line this out for us.
Yeah.
Um, let's say you're walking at a show, you're looking at the tables, right? And you spot an image.
Mhm.
What is the analysis that you go through? What do you look at first? What is the checklist for you that you look at?
So I usually have a scope of some sort because I'm going to want to look at that in the light to get a real close look, see if I can pick up any buttons, so I can identify a state button. Um, I'm looking for things that are not easy for the naked eye. That's one thing I'm doing, is trying to find something unusual, and typically it's a state button, particularly in Confederates. So if I can figure out if he's a Georgia or an Alabama soldier, pick out a button. So I always have a magnifying glass of some sort. They're not expensive. It's good to travel and go to a show with that. And also sometimes good to go to a show with a little pen light, a little flashlight, because sometimes the lighting in these shows is not fantastic. And if you can get some light on an image, you're going to see things much clearer than it just, leaning over a case looking in there. But and a lot of the dealers aren't really super excited with you taking the image out of the case. I get that. But if they're okay, can you look in the back to see if there is a penciled identification of that soldier in there, who he was, what unit he was in? That's the thrill of the hunt. The thrill of the hunt.
Could you describe maybe your favorite image in your collection, or maybe the best barnyard find, if you will?
Yeah, I have a nice Confederate image that comes in a case. The case is identified to a New Orleans studio, and he's wearing a very dark uniform. I can't remember the name of the guy. I'm sorry, I can't help you with that, Paul. I've got it written down, but I took it out of the case, and he's identified in the back of the case. It turns out, and when I bought it, it was not identified. I mean, I didn't buy it as being an identified image. That's not how it came to me, but it was identified. It turns out that this guy had fought in the Texas Revolution. And so he's wearing a very dark uniform, kind of a cavalier hat, kind of a cowboy hat pinned up a little bit. And he's probably in his mid-20s at this point. He ultimately became a general officer. He resigned his commission and became governor of Louisiana, and then went into exile to Mexico at the end of the war. And I wonder if there's a chance that this uniform might be his uniform from the Republic of Texas days, because it's not a Confederate looking uniform. It's not the double-breasted buttons. It's not what you would expect. So I've got this little fancy that this was the start of the war, and he grabbed his uniform because he was a lieutenant in the Texas Revolution. But I don't know Texas Revolution, I don't know Texas Revolution uniforms. There's somebody out there who would know, that I'd love to have take a look at it. But that was the huge surprise. I paid a lot for it. It's a quarter plate ambrotype, and it was the identified case, so I paid quite a bit for it. But I didn't really know who he was identified, and that he actually was somebody somewhat famous. So that's my attic find, I guess, my favorite attic find.
Well, I love it. I'd love to see that image. And I think this also shares with us the idea that, listen, when you see these images on a dealer's table, dealers are dealing with a lot of images all at the same time.
Yeah.
They're not able to research every single image.
Right.
So potentially you have a research project with each of these images, which can be really fun.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, here's the good news. So my buddy Chris and I'm working on the fourth volume, which is a Union volume of photographs. Chris just finished the fifth volume, Confederate. And it's at the printer right now. We're going to do the Wheaton show, so we'll have it at the Wheaton show in September. But it includes that image of that general officer in the fifth volume. So maybe we'll see if we can't get that to you.
Well, with that said, can you talk a little bit about the books, how they came to be, what do they cover, and how can people get access to these books? Where can they purchase them?
Well, Chris and I were at the Wheaton show 10 years ago, 12 years ago. and said, well, wouldn't it be fun to, just publish a book? They're self-published. We use a publisher, but we pay for it. It's not sponsored. And, we'll do 2 books, for one for you, one for me, and maybe a couple for friends. So maybe we get a printing of 10. Well, we got the printing of 10 of the first one, and the first one was a Confederate volume. And people liked it so much, we're like, well, maybe, we don't make any money on these. We barely break even on these. But I think we printed 100 of each volume. And you can get them from my website, which is soldiercollectibles.com. So it's soldier singular, collectibles plural.com. So I sell them on there along with I probably have, I bet I have 150 or 200 images on the site that are for sale today. And it's a lot of work, by the way. If anybody out there is thinking about publishing a book, it is a ton of work. The first book we did was kind of an experiment. We figured out how to scan images better. So we'll show the image in its exact current state, whether if it's dark and it's tough to see, we'll show it what it really looks like, and then we'll enhance the images to really bring out certain features. So it's always a one in the matte, and then with the matte off, and then we'll blow up a headshot, and then we'll feature a weapon, or if they're sitting at a table, we'll feature a tablecloth, because we want it to be used as a reference. So if you can find an image where it has the exact same tablecloth, you're on your road to possibly identifying when and where it was taken. And a prime example is the Reese studio in Richmond, Virginia. Reese has a very particular chair. He had a very particular tablecloth, and he has a very particular column. So you see a lot of these images that are not identified or not signed Reese images, but you can identify that they are in fact a Reese image from his studio, because they're very distinct tablecloth. So we try and focus in on features of that sort to help the collector maybe move towards an identification of an image they have that has the same backdrop or has the same tablecloth. You see a lot that have the same weapons, because as we were discussing earlier, they were studio props. So you often see, the same weapons. You'll see that same backdrop, and you'll say to yourself, that looks like that same Springfield rifle that was in this other image. So you're hunting for clues. You're doing the Dick Tracy stuff, detective work here.
And I've got to say, I'll put links in the description so people can access your website, of course. I have several of the volumes. They are truly the ultimate reference guide for
Thank
any
you.
collector in regards to Civil War photography. I'll just put that out there.
Oh, thank you.
I'll also say this: if someone is not particularly interested in collecting photography on the Civil War, these are still great, like, coffee table books that you can just have out and open them up and just look at some real art, high resolution scans, and just admire. And you can pretty much pick it up and open it anywhere and start reading, right? They're just great like that.
Yeah. Well, and one thing, Paul, that we did was we try and put a scoring system in there. So we're not putting all the best images. We're putting some images that would not be your favorites, but we score them for clarity, for contrast, how light they are they identified, they get an up score. If it's a quarter plate, it gets a higher score than a 6th plate or a 9th plate. And we try to come up with this uniform scoring mechanism to, accurately evaluate the quality. And so a perfect score would be a 50 in our little scoring scheme here. In the book that we just finished, that's at the publisher, I think the highest score that any image got was 42. So there's no perfect image out there. There is no perfect image out there. You can always find you can often find a flaw. I'm sure some collectors have perfect ones. I just can't afford those. But we try and give a very objective score of what this image is. We don't assign a value to it, because what's valuable to you is different than what's valuable to me. So that would be a lost cause trying to assign a value to it. But we do trying to assign a quality image score to it.
Well, I would say that the perfect image is the one that always got away, right?
Isn't that the truth? And we've all had them, and it doesn't matter whether you're collecting buttons or pistols or a forge caps, whatever it happens to be. When you're at that show and you see that perfect image, you better buy it now, because when you circle and come back and you decide you want it, there's a really good chance it's going to be gone. So don't walk away from what you want. Seize the moment.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on. This has been a lot of fun, and I hope we can do it again, and maybe talk about some other images in your collection.
Would love to. I've got a lot. Would love to. Maybe we'll come up with a theme. Maybe we'll come up with a New York theme, or something of that sort. But I would look forward to I look forward to you reaching out to me again.
Well, I greatly appreciate. Thank you.